Nope, nope. That's why I want to do this first. There we go. That's the right button. Okay, should we just go ahead and get started, Lisa? Oh, you're muted. Okay, so I'm going to assume you said yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I said yes.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
let's go ahead and get started. Yeah.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming by and this evening, this morning, this afternoon, depending on your time zone, to the Neo4j Desktop public review of our just released Neo4j Desktop 1.3.1 version. We had actually released 1.3.0 just last week, found a small problem that we tried to make a fix to, and then quickly turned around this patch release that we just got out today. I'd like to introduce generally Neo4j Desktop. For those of you who haven't seen it before, so my agenda, of course, is just to reintroduce Desktop to you, like what it is as far as Neo4j is concerned, and like what was this thing. And then, of course, just get right into a demo of the new features. And if you haven't seen it before, a little demo of Desktop itself that will be a good introduction. And then we can get into a Q&A session that we're going to be doing using Zoom's facilities, as well as we can manage those. And Lisa, who you just met, is going to help us coordinate all of that. So Neo4j Desktop. As far as Neo4j is concerned, Neo4j, of course, the primary thing that we deliver to you is a database called Neo4j Graph Database. Desktop is really a packaging of Neo4j database delivered as a native application available on macOS, Windows, and Linux as well. It makes it easy to spin up Neo4j, create new databases, and now has some new facilities like being able to manage files and things. But primarily the job of Desktop is to deliver software, where that software is either the database itself, but then also tools that work with the database, where our primary tools that we care about are, of course, Neo4j Browser and Neo4j Bloom, Neo4j ETL, which is pretty fantastic for getting data into Neo4j, but then also a growing list of third-party applications from our friends at GraphXR or Graphalytic, and there's others like that that are building apps that work with Neo4j. So it's a nice way to just kind of get started and get a good set of tools for working with databases generally, and then going on to production systems if you'd like to. For Neo4j Desktop 1.3.1, the very particular things that we've added in this release, we were focusing on kind of the life cycle of managing databases, where every now and again, of course, for backup purposes, for instance, you might create database dumps. Before now, you would do that using command line tooling with Neo4j, which worked just well, but it's convenient to be able to do that directly through the user interface. So we added that ability, and that's one of the things I'll demonstrate, so that you can, if you have a database inside of Desktop, you can create a dump file from it. If you happen to have a dump file, you can create a database from it. So you can go of course, both directions. This ends up being pretty convenient, of course, if you're, for instance, working in Sandbox, and you could create a database dump from that, or if you're working in Aura, you want to create a database from that, or if you want to go the other direction, if you have a database and you want to get it out to Aura, you could create a dump file and then send that up to Aura, and then go into production. So I think that's a small but substantial feature actually to add to the Desktop tool set. I'd also go ahead and point out some of the changes we've made to the sidebar, which are in and of themselves, I think, pleasant, but they also indicate a general direction that we're going with Desktop and what it's able to do and like how it thinks about working with Neo4j. And I'll spend a little bit of time as I demo it, talking about those changes in direction. And I'll also give you a little preview of a new capability that's available inside of Neo4j Browser that is, of course, supported by Desktop as well, which is having what we call Neo4j Browser guides, but now in a new format called MDX. So if you're familiar with Markdown, this is similar to Markdown, but it's Markdown focused on being used in more of a slide deck kind of presentation. And also the X part of it has to do with adding interactive components. So there's, for instance, an open source project called MDX Deck, which makes fantastic use of this format for just creating general slide decks. Inside of Browser, our use of it is a bit more focused on just having interactive slide decks that use Neo4j, of course, But I think that's going to be exciting. And I'd love to get any opinions about that as I showed off, about things you'd like to see or where you think this is a useful direction for us. That's really it for my slide deck. It's time to actually go ahead and show Neo4j itself. So let me see if I can successfully switch over here. And Neo4j is already, of course, up and running in full screen mode. If you're new to desktop, I'll take the time just for a minute to go ahead and go through a quick overview of what we've got here. Inside of desktop, we arrange things grouped inside of projects with a desire to actually have projects be a way of having related Cypher queries and related things like browser guides and databases that all make sense to have together. If you're just getting started, you might just have one project and one database, and that's perfectly okay. But as you pick up a development project, you have sort of a development database you've got, maybe you've got a test database that you end up adding, and then maybe a staging and a production, all could be in one project. That makes it convenient to then just kind of switch between your focus between doing development work versus working on all staying within inside of desktop itself. And you can create as many databases and projects. Something that is new that we didn't have previously in desktop is that we've always had the ability to manage multiple databases, of course. We've now added a specific database drawer here on the sidebar that if you open that up, you'll see the databases that I have created. Actually, there's two different sets here. I happen to have one Neo4j database that's in the 4.1.0 version of Neo4j, and it's used inside of one project. I also have Neo4j 4.03, but it's not used inside of any projects, so it's just there. You know, if I want to spin up a new project, it's already been downloaded, it's ready to go. But if I want to just clean up, it's easy that I can just click the delete here, and then 4.03 is gone. I don't get that delete button on 4.1.0 because it's still being used inside of a project. So our thinking here is that it'd be better to go through and actually make sure that you don't have it in any projects, that you've removed it from where you're currently using it, and then we can get rid of the installation if that's what you want to do. We've also added the application drawer, which was always there. It used to be down here in the bottom. We simply moved it to the top so that it's grouped with projects and databases. This trio of projects for organizing your work, databases, of course, for being the meat of managing databases themselves, and then applications for how you have access to lots of different tools you can use with those databases. Here you can see that I've added lots of extra tools beyond just the basics. So, you know, there's this GraphQL tooling that I've added, Voyager and the GraphQL itself, the classic one. I've been experimenting with using Mermaid inside of Neo4j. So, you know, I created an app for that and added it to the list here as well. And then, of course, favorites like Neo4j Bloom and Neo4j Browser and ETL tool all just appear here in the list. From the sidebar, as you'd expect, so I could just click on Browser and it'll pop open. Already connected to Neo4j. Browser has been getting a bit of love on cleanup or use of different colors and trying to make a better use of contrast and better organization of the overall sort of information architecture of the color schemes. And this is coming along really nicely. I think it looks pretty sharp now. Switching back to desktop for a second, the other thing I want to then showcase, of course, is the great new capability that desktop has for creating database dumps. So I've got this movie database here. I should first stop the database so that I'm not trying to create a dump on a running database. And then in the context menu, I can just choose to create a dump file. We'll get a little loader. Neo4j will go off and work on this. And we've created a dump file. Now, notice, of course, here that here we've successfully created a dump of the Neo4j database from within the movies. Movies is actually the overall name of the DBMS. Particularly with Neo4j 4.0, we've made the transition from being able to only have, well, previously was only one database per DBMS. Now we can have multiple databases per DBMS. So we're starting to echo some and moving towards a point where we can actually manage multiple databases per DBMS inside of desktop. That'll be a continued evolution for us. So I've just created this dump file though, and you can see we've given it a name, you know, named after the DBMS that it came from and the database in that DBMS, and then we kind of encoded a timestamp into the name as well. So it's pretty easy to identify what this was about. Okay. If I then go to the context menu for this dump file, I can immediately create a new database from this dump file. And the way that we create databases from dump files because we still haven't fully made the transition to multi-database inside of desktop, is we create an entirely new DBMS. So whether this dump file came from within desktop itself, or if it came from Aura, you could use this button here and you end up going through the same dialogue of creating a new DBMS. I'll call this movies2. I'll give it a super secret password and then spin up that DBMS. And because I've created this DBMS from the dump file, we create this new DBMS. It'll be a 410 also, and it'll automatically already have a data set in it. So if I start this up, as long as the demo gods are still with me, by the time this starts, we'll be able to switch over to browser and see that this already has, of course, the movie data set, our classic go-to data set for showing off graphs. So it's finally active, and I'll open up Neo4j Browser. Neo4j Browser has reconnected to this new database. And if we go to the sidebar, of course, we see that there's movies and people, and I could ask for, get me a sample of all the acted in relationships, and I get this lovely graph of things. Oops, wrong button. The classics, right? And we've got, always Keanu Reeves and all the Matrix characters are our favorites. Cool, so that is the quick tour of Neo4j Desktop with our new database dump and load and the sidebar. And the last thing that I want to introduce to you that I'd love to get some feedback on, and I'd love feedback about any of these features, of course. You have both me as the product manager and Liza as the lead designer on desktop. Willing to hear any kind of feedback you've got, positive or negative or otherwise. We're definitely open for suggestions, so please don't hold back. The last thing I was going to show is what we're doing with MDX now. So I've got an example file here that's an MDX. And if I just click on that, we've associated that with Neo4j Browser when you're running inside of desktop. And that just opens up as what is at the moment still very similar to a normal Neo4j browser guide. Now, this is a browser guide that, just like any browser guide, you can page through. This one particularly is just kind of our sample markdown for testing all the different Markdown syntax that we do the correct rendering of it. And we're going to be iterating on the styling here a little bit. But you can see already a few things that is different from normal Markdown. So if I start at the beginning here, this is just a regular single page of Markdown that has a title and then some paragraph text and some links. That's exactly as you'd expect it to be. The second slide starts to get interesting because now there's two columns. In regular Markdown, there's no way to designate that you have one text. You could use a table if you wanted to, or you could use HTML and do something. Or if you're using MDX and MDX Deck, MDX Deck has JSX components that you could use. So you could actually have, you could describe different layouts using that. We thought about adopting any of those different approaches. And what we thought we'd like to do is keep the Markdown as plain as possible and not have too much in the way of kind of layout oriented things. And so we thought instead what we would end up doing is adding a new syntax to Markdown that allows you to designate not only here's a division that indicates here's a new slide, but within a new slide, here's a new column for the current row that I'm working on, and then also have multiple rows. And so using a slightly different syntax that I'll show you when I show the, when I flip over to the Markdown version of this, or the text version of this rather than the rendered version. But so this is plain Markdown otherwise. Oh, and actually, I'm sorry, here's actually one of the slides here actually talks about that. So if we're doing guide layout, we have three different ways of indicating splits in the content. The first is the one that was established by MDX Deck itself, that if you use the 3 dashes in plain Markdown, that just means do a hard rule. But if you use that within MDX, that actually ends up meaning that you want that to indicate a new slide. So following that same idea of just using simple character patterns for indicating splits and things, we invented 2 new splits. One is a horizontal split, which ends up creating a new row. And so that is also kind of 3 dashes, but with pipes in between. And if instead we want, it's really this pipe in the middle, sorry, the dash in the middle indicates horizontal. Instead, if you want a vertical split to create a new column for the current row, you'd end up using a dash and then 3 pipes and then a dash. Between those two, you can actually create lots of interesting layouts. You can create obviously just a split view pretty easily. You could have a header and a footer, and then the middle part could be, multiple columns. I think it's a pretty nice way to actually work with easy layout. And the other thing that we've added that's, so this is regular JSX. This just happens to illustrate that we can just do, we accept literal values rather than, if it was full JSX, you'd be able to do small JavaScript expressions and things. It's proper. Within Neo4j Browser, we didn't want to have all of that capability. If that's really what you'd want to do, that kind of goes into the territory of really doing application development rather than just creating a slide deck. And so we thought, okay, we're going to restrict the JSX that's possible to just the components that we've made available. And then for those components, you can add parameters as long as they are just literal values rather than expressions or functions. So this is one example of that, using some literal JSX notation for deciding that it needs to be green. And then the last part that we added is that whenever you do try to use some sort of syntax that's illegal, we capture that and we just wrap that in a little error reporting thing. So here, the body of the error message here, this is actually what you were trying to do, where this markdown had a paragraph that just said slides with syntax errors are replaced with an error message. And it's this part here, that character, that created the problem. It was unexpected plain text. And so we ended up flagging that and then wrapping that all in just an error display instead. If I switch back over to desktop and open up this in the Finder, here's the MDX that I've got. If I go ahead and just open that MDX with Visual Studio Code, we can see the plain markdown that's actually driving this stuff. So here's the plain markdown, and I guess just to prove that it's the same text, I'll get rid of that part of it, for instance, and save it. Just to prove, I guess, that this isn't a, yeah, but I'm not faking this demo. This is a live demo with real code. The with ABK just dropped out of this title. Okay, good, that actually works. Whoops. And this then is what the markdown looks like. This is plain everyday markdown, nothing too special here. The 3 dashes to create a new slide. We support all the standard, header type things. And then here's an example of using our new syntax for actually indicating a split. That's why this particular slide ended up being a split view between the left and the right side. So before the split, you end up with the left side, and then after the split, you end up with the right side. You can still do tables the way you would in normal Markdown. Well, normal, one of the flavors of Markdown that supports tables. Of course, we support that as well. Standard code blocks are supported. All of that sort of stuff is nice. A little bit further down, this is the simplest version of JSX is just using HTML. HTML, of course, is sort of JSX because JSX can render it, make it into a component. So this is really just a paragraph where we've added some styling. That works perfectly fine because we're just doing literal JSX here. We're just passing in values to parameterize something rather than passing in something that would be interpreted as a functional call or some sort of expression. And then here at this last slide, we see an instance that looks like it might be legal because, okay, we're just passing in a value to this JSX. But of course, we know that this really ends up meaning that's probably a variable that you're expecting to exist, but we don't allow variable binding. Instead, this has to be a value that you're passing in. So that ends up getting flagged and then becoming an error component. Okay, that was a kind of a whirlwind tour of the features that we've added in desktop. I think these are, each of them, nice improvements, and I'm pretty interested in finding out how people think about this. Oh, cool. And at least on my screen, I don't know if you see it on yours as well. So we have a couple of polls that we've added on here. So I'd love to get any of your opinions on this stuff, like about MDX particularly. Here is this first question. And I'll go ahead and answer the polls as we go through as well, so we can do it together. How likely is it that MDX format would create extra value for you as a user? Well, I'm very high on MDX, so I'm going to say this is very likely. I think this stuff is a lot of fun. But of course, please tell me, of course, if you think it's very unlikely that you're not going to do anything with MDX. So this is kind of a silly thing for us to do.
Yeah, just so that since we are not so many, if you have some strong opinion that you would like to express, just unmute yourself and talk to us.
Fantastic. Yeah, and Lisa, I'm not sure with the Zoom polling, how does that actually work? So we all end up adding to the poll. Is there a place where we can see the results of the poll?
It's actually the first time I'm using it, so we'll see how it goes. It's a bit of an experiment for us too. So I think me as the host of this meeting, I'll see the results. I don't know, can you see the results right now? Or
I cannot,
do you
no.
just see the, yeah, okay. Yeah, because I see like results and progress, basically.
Okay.
And I see that it was 14 people who answered, so almost everyone, which is great. And there's been just 2 votes for unlikely or very unlikely, and the rest are very positive or positive.
Okay.
Yeah, so if any of you want to talk a little bit more in detail about MDX possibilities in browser, just feel free to talk to us. Or again, like if you have any other questions of it, if anything is not super clear.
What are some use cases for MDX?
Yeah, so the use cases that we have in mind, there are 2 things that I'm hoping will provide some value here. That being able to create your own browser guides itself, I think is valuable. As browser guides exist today, it's not an easy publishing workflow that we even have for our own content. By being able to work just straight in Markdown, I think it'll be easier to actually create content. Even as I just today during the demo was able to switch to VS Code, make some changes, and then save it, and then it updates. So I think that in of itself will be useful. And that ends up meaning that if you see browser guides that are useful that you'd like to just create your own version of or modify, that becomes something that's super easy to do. The next thing that I think is really powerful about it, even maybe more powerful than simply being able to edit, is the kinds of components we'll be able to make available inside of MDX. That X part of it, right now we're not exploiting, but we want to be able to add components for things like adding charts or different kinds of interactivity, so that we have the ability to create, and I'm going to show my age here, of course, for a moment, but like, in the good old days when HyperCard was still a thing and people were excited about HyperCard, it was pretty easy to create small interactive pieces inside of just HyperCard because you had this kind of stack metaphor where every slide within a stack, you could do different kinds of interactions. You could have buttons that did things. You'll be able to have buttons and forms that are interactive that can produce things like charts, whether those are sort of classic pie chart type things or just graph visualizations. We were able to add components that do any of those kinds of things. So MDX ends up being the basis for kind of lightweight, I guess I'd call it, lightweight application development. And a hidden benefit of doing that is that the X part is really React.js. So if you happen to be a React.js developer, you can essentially do small prototyping apps just by using the MDX format, and then take exactly the components you have in MDX, because we'll make the libraries that support the components available. You can take that code, move it over to a React app that you have, and it should just work. Now, of course, the just work means it's not going to be quite that simple. You'll also have to plug it into Neo4j. You'll have to connect it to a database, give it the right context, but it'll be a nice way to actually do a little bit of prototyping to save some time.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, this is Pete. I have a question about where to host those MDX guys. Is there a kind of directory where we can put them in on the server side so people can access them rather than specifying a URL up there?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So at the moment for desktop, of course, desktop has local file access. So exactly what I just did here, I just added this file to a project, and if it's in a project, then desktop can load it directly. What we haven't done yet is sort of take that another step here, which would be, I think, nice, so that rather than actually having the file here, if you just have a URL to the file, that people could just click on that. Neither of those things really quite help if everybody has to have desktop installed in order to use this stuff. So something that we've been working on, which I'm going to just swear you all to secrecy about, is inside of desktop is really just a web server, right? Like this is an Electron-based application. It's all based in JavaScript. Really all we have is a web server that is hosting this stuff and normal JavaScript and HTML for the UI bits. We've been working on a long kind of internal project where we're taking that stuff out of desktop so that it can be hosted separately. So that means that both the applications that are running and also the content like MDX will be able to be hosted by this app server. At that point, then you could just put that app server anywhere you want to, and the Markdown X format itself will also be able to be displayed.
Okay, thanks.
Is that actually helpful enough? And
yeah, and I think the same would apply for those grass files too. If they could be stored server side. I think
absolutely true.
The user who comes there the first time, they don't know about all of this and how to use it.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree with you. That's one of our challenges right now, is that this is interesting if you happen to know about it all, but if you don't know what it is, then it's not super clear like why this is interesting or what to do with it.
And let me go back because I might have missed this spot, but exactly how did you get this example.mdx file?
Oh yeah, so this one here happens to be in the, so all of the projects now are just normal file system folders that they happen to be, if I look at this full directory here, they're down in some, subfolder of Neo4j Desktop itself. But because they are normal file system folders, this is just exactly on my macOS file system. So if I rename this file, for instance, to abk-example, desktop sees that it's a different file name and actually updates. So this UI here is really just a layer on top of the native OS interface. And actually, I don't know, I don't recall quite what's on the post coming up, but like one question that we have about this that we've been also working on, but we're not sure how much emphasis to put on, is this is the first step towards having all projects be normal file system folders. What I just demonstrated is that actually that's maybe nice, but this folder is buried off in some secret directory. We're doing a little bit of experimentation around how to take those directories and let them live anywhere. So if I want to put stuff in my, I don't know, what's a good folder here? Let's say I want to put it in my download directory for whatever reason. I should be able to create a folder in this download directory and hand that to desktop, and desktop should be able to manage that the same way that it manages any of the other folders, as an example. Some of the workflows that we're imagining that would help with is if you are doing development and you happen to be using something like Git, you probably have somewhere a development directory. You have a bunch of Git repositories that you've just cloned. Rather than dragging all of those into and having extra projects inside of desktop, it would be great if desktop could just know about those directories. So if you happen to have a source code project that also has some Cypher files, you can just directly double click those files and they open up in the Neo4j browser, as an example.
Yeah, since you mentioned this, one of the plans for the future for desktop, I have some more questions today. So the next poll is about Neo4j browser improvements, and there is a lot of different questions, a lot of different options, and we think that those should be priorities, but what would be a priority for you? That's what interests us today. Yeah, and again, we can discuss any of those in details. Maybe let's take a couple of minutes and then we can talk about them.
Lisa, what do you think about me just reading through the options here to describe them a bit as people are thinking?
Yeah, that would be great. Yes, thanks.
So for potential improvements to Neo4j browser, this first one, saving your browser session locally, the observation we have there, actually I'll say generally that we keep getting inspiration from some of the many brilliant things that are happening in the VS Code universe. I don't know how many people are using Visual Studio Code or what other tooling you use, but VS Code is doing a lot of things really well for developers, I think. And one example of what they do well is they have this ability to that if you've opened up a bunch of files that you're working with and you just quit, when you come back, it just restores the thing you were working on previously. It's easier said than done, but it seems like such a nice thing to add that we thought, okay, that was this first one on the list here. It's like, okay, if you have a session in browser and you've got some queries you've already run that are in the stream, you want to be able to just pull those back up when after you've closed browser and you come back, should you pick up where you left off. And so that's what that first one is about. Second one is about the Cypher editor window, which is, of course, the top bar. Let me switch over to browser, I guess. It's this bar up here, which starts off a single line. If you, type something and then hit Shift Return, if you happen to know to hit Shift Return, it'll go into multi-line. And if you keep hitting Return once you're in multi-line, it will expand a little bit, but not a whole lot. So, you can get as many lines as you'd like to, but you only see a few of them at a time. And if you happen to know how to hit Escape, you can go into full screen mode and see more lines. So this second request here about improvements, being able to resize the Cypher editor window, is exactly about this interaction of like switching between single line to multi-line. When you switch to multi-line, how many multi in the multi-line? Is it 10? Is it 20? Should it be configurable? Should you be able to drag it up and down? Getting in and out of full screen mode, what does that mean? What are those interactions like? So there's in that very small statement of resizing Cypher editor window, there's a lot of questions in our mind about like what is it you'd like to you'd prefer out of this environment. And I guess part of that ends up being like, do you spend a lot of time with really long Cypher queries, or is it mostly just single Cypher queries at a time, single statement? The single statement shows up in another question later on. The third one then here is about semantic autocomplete, which gets into, again, a bit of Visual Studio Code maybe showing up here bias, but like what I would otherwise call IntelliSense, where like, so if I say match and, if I can type it all, and then here, if I decide to say return, so even now it should be telling me to type tab to complete return. If I type n here, Cypher editor has no idea that this n and the previous n are related. Even worse, if I then did something like, if I have, actually that's at least case different. Let's say I had a relationship called near, and then, doesn't matter, some m. It doesn't know the difference between n, the node, and near, the relationship. And so for any kind of autocompletes, really what you want to end up having is things that know the context. So they know, the difference between, if I ask n dot something, okay, I'm clearly talking about this previous n, which maybe I've said was a person. Okay, so that much at least works. But when I do the autocomplete here for the dot, what properties from that person I would want to return, should we know about like properties related to persons? Should there be all the properties? That gets into semantic autocomplete. So knowing the difference between nodes, relationships, and keys, how they're all related to each other, so that you get the right information when you're trying to do autocomplete. This is one of my favorite features because I'd love to have it. It's also not non-trivial to implement. So something for us to think about. File-like operations in the sidebar really has to do with in this sidebar here where you can save scripts and you have at least one layer of folders you can work with. You can do simple things like move, okay, maybe. Okay, so basic ideas of like actually just manipulating those lists aren't super apparent. And particularly now that we have file capabilities in desktop itself, we'd like all of these queries to really be files on disk. And once those are actually files on disk, you'd expect to be able to do file-like operations to them. So could you select this one here, duplicate it, rename it, and the file on disk is renamed when you've renamed it here, or it's duplicated when you've duplicated it here. So that's what that fourth one really means. Adding more Neo4j browser commands. Examples here are for like file type operations. So if we add file type operations, should we have commands for those kinds of things? So opening a file, listing the files that are available, could that be something that you'd want to be able to do up here? The reason to do that really has to do with this follow-on one here. If you haven't used multi-statement at the moment, let's see, where's, oops, browser is not responding to me at the moment. Okay. This is where the demo gods are finally, there we go. You have an option here to turn on multi-statements in the query editor. A multi-statement is a little bit different than a multi-line statement, which is simply multiple lines with a single statement. This would be if I wanted to return 1 and then also return 2 and run both of that. Those are two separate Cypher queries. If you want to, you can actually combine Cypher queries with browser-side commands. We're not sure whether or not that's useful given the current set of commands, so we're thinking about adding extra commands, but also we're not sure whether anybody wants to do any of that kind of stuff. An example could be that you actually use a browser-side command for setting some parameters, and then the next statement actually uses those parameters, and then on the browser side, you change the parameters based on that query, and then you could end up with a sequence of operations that switch between browser-side things to do, and then sending a query, and then based on that result, doing something else on the browser side, and kind of having multi-sequence operations as a result of that. So that's why both this one here about having new commands that are added, and then assuming that multi-statement is actually the default way you want to work, should we turn that on by default? And the last one on the list here, and this is a fantastic list, so these are all good choices, so there's not a bad choice here, is being able to re-edit any frame. And the best way to show that is, so here I've created, of course, this multi-statement that has two results. If I wanted to change one of these queries, the only way I can do that is by, at the moment, clicking it, that creates a new query for me, actually. So if I can edit it, so I can, instead of saying return 2, I can have the very valuable return 3 query. And now I've got two frames just because I want to change the value of this second statement. Instead, what this re-edit frame item is about is being able to simply double click or have some sort of interaction here where in place you change this query and then just run it again. So rather than creating extra frames every time you want to rerun something, you change the query, run it again, change the query, run it again. You know, you could imagine doing that in full screen mode and any of the different sizes to try to couple it with all the different, all of these are, I think, really well reinforcing each other capabilities. Okay, but that's the full list that I've explained. Does anyone have questions about those capabilities? Okay.
They're thinking.
Intrigued. I'm gonna go ahead and vote. I'm gonna vote for. Actually, I have to admit that I really want this one because this semantic autocomplete, the IntelliSense, ends up leading down a path of just broadly getting help while you're typing. And I don't write Cypher enough to always remember some parts of the Cypher language. Some parts of the Cypher language, I end up reaching for the Cypher reference guide, the fantastic reference guide, just to remind myself about like the syntax. I would rather the editor just tells me like, oh yeah, this is the next legal thing to do, or that thing you just typed is not legal. So I really like that one. That's gonna be my submission. It's because I have a bad memory. And also it's a complex, you know, it's a very heavy language.
Yeah, it's also a big important part of the onboarding for new users. Instead of looking into docs or going through guides, this would be very helpful to have. But yeah, as you said, everything is important in this list.
All really good choices.
All of them, yeah. So just want to know what is it that's the most important for you. Now it says 9 out of 15 people voted. Let's wait a couple of more minutes. It's not an easy choice, that's for sure.
So while we're waiting for another vote or so, does anyone have anything that wasn't on that list that you'd love to add to that list?
That's also a good question. Yeah. If you have anything, just feel free to talk about it or drop a line in the chat. Yeah.
One thing I like to see is more color choices, for the nodes. It's pretty limited, Very soon I run out of colors and it gets confusing. The other thing is the font size. It'd be nice if it could resize itself so the text stays within that circle, if possible. I mean, there's some limits if the text is too long, but sometimes it's just cut off. It'd be nice if it just adjusts itself if possible. Or the circle adjusts itself, to fit the text if the font size is fixed. Something along those lines.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Thanks. Yeah, there was a few other requests about graph visualization in browser. So I think we'll get there in one of the next development phases.
Yeah, the color choice one is interesting. I think those are both great observations. And if I could follow on with that with another question, like one capability that we have in browser that is pretty much hidden. Somebody mentioned it earlier, that there is this thing called GRASS files, which is our graph style sheets. And so we don't, I think you're absolutely right. Like actually just through the visualization itself, like through the user interface, it'd be nice to be able to just add extra colors here, like have your own color palette definition, perhaps. That could be a nice improvement. And the only other way to do it right now is if you happen to know how to get to the style sheet and then edit the style sheet. The style sheet isn't obvious, but there's this style command. And so if you just say :style, you'll end up seeing this JSON representation, more or less. I guess this isn't quite JSON, this is more, is this all valid CSS? Actually, I think this is valid CSS. It's valid CSS with some extra keys that are particular to us, like about the font size and the border color and things like that. So you can actually edit these and then add your own style sheet to the browser. That's one of the areas that we haven't paid a lot of attention to, but if that's a high value thing to do, then that's really great to know that we could spend a bit more time focusing on improving that.
Andreas, can you edit that in the browser window? I didn't think you could.
You can't edit it directly. No, that's one of the.
You have to copy it out and reload it as a graph file.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
We had high
nice
aspirations.
If you could edit it in the window.
Yeah, totally. To be honest, when we implemented this, we did this with that kind of aspiration. Realized that we didn't have a good way to catch parsing errors. Is really the truth of it. Like we're like, oh, what do we do with a something when the parse error happens? We completely failed, and so the temporary solution was like, okay, well, we're not going to allow editing right now. We'll get back to that once we have a parser, and never got back to it. So if that's a useful thing to get back to, then we'll take a look at it.
Yeah, well, I for one would like that because it's a bit of a pain to have to edit your graphs file outside and then pull it back in. Although drag and drop makes that a bit easier. Although it took me a long time to realize that the frame had disappeared off the favorites, and that you just dragged it anywhere on there.
Right. Can I ask, do you think it'd be useful to have support for multiple style sheets or just one big style sheet?
I'd say multiple, so by project or by
project
database even.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be personally that would be useful because I've got lots of different projects. And of course, then you've got this. Well, it just becomes a huge file then to maintain because you've got to go and find your nodes, etc. So one per project, right. One per database would be better, but one per project would be a big improvement, I think.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, that would be great if all of you could vote for one of the items on the list in the poll. I understand it's probably quite hard to make a choice, but I think we need to move on to another question. Maybe let's see if I can launch two polls at the same time. No, it doesn't look like that. Anyway, one other question that we'd like to discuss is about redistribution of Neo4j Desktop inside an organization. If any one of you is a part of an organization where you need to distribute many desktops on many computers, and that's problematic currently because that's pretty much manually. Would like to know more about your experience.
Yeah, so some of the background to this, and I think if I remember, did I see Elaine? Did you join the call? We've gotten requests around this from two different directions, or maybe it's kind of the same direction, but it's really large organizations that have decided that they like desktop well enough to give it to more than just individuals downloading it themselves, and so they want to manage the installation of it. And one context, I guess, was universities that thought, hey, this would be great to just put on in our computer lab. So if people want to use Neo4j, they each get their own local one. We can wipe that disk and we kind of manage it that way. That'll be just fine. So that was one context. And the other is, of course, just larger organizations that have where individuals maybe aren't able to install their own software in the first place. So they have to lobby the organization to make Neo4j Desktop available in their own internal distribution so that they then could get access to it. And in both cases, what on our side we really lack is proper packaging, I guess is what it comes down to, that is friendly for that kind of multiple installation. So I don't know if anybody here is in a context where that would be interesting, or where you have an internal distribution mechanism. We're not sure where to start, like what the most useful one would be to kind of focus on. And I'm sorry,
Yeah,
you were going to put a post up for that, or a poll?
Yeah, I have a
Or
poll. I
is it just a
just
discussion?
can't. I think I need to end this poll. I hope everyone who wanted to say something did that. Otherwise, just reach out to us again. And I'm gonna start another poll, which is exactly this desktop distribution. So if the answer is no, just also please say it so we know the how much it's important for all of you.
And I think I might have cut somebody off.
Alessandro Zelane, I just wanted to say that what our educators frequently ask for is installation of Neo4j Desktop in lab environments, and they would like some sort of silent install to be able to install it that way, to automate the installation.
Do you know any more details about when the automation? Is it like through just I don't know, bash scripts, or is there actually like a more formal mechanism?
I don't know how they're doing that type of installation, but it is time consuming if they want it installed on a lot of lab machines for them. So if we had some sort of bash script, that would be great.
Okay.
Yeah, I see that a couple of people saying yes to the question. If you have any good experience from working with other software or anything, just feel free to tell us more about it. I'd like to know best practices and what exactly is that you want.
It's a great observation, Lisa. Yeah. Who does this really well? We're happy to imitate.
Yeah.
We're not proud. We'll just do it the way somebody else does it. We're really good at the graph stuff. We're not so smart about how do you do software distribution. That's not our strength. But we're going to get there.
We're getting there.
We're getting there. Cool. And I will answer. Do we distribute software in Neo4j? Oh, I think I'll answer this yes, and I'll say that for Neo4j, what we want is the web-hosted version. So distributing desktop by not distributing desktop. That's my submission. Cool, and we have about 5 minutes left.
Yeah.
Do you, if anybody actually has any particular questions you'd love to ask me, we could have a quick discussion about that while we still have some time.
In the meantime, I'm gonna launch just one last poll. I'm saving this result here. And the last one is about Cypher and external editors. If you are interested in using Cypher with external editors, something that you're used to, yeah. But rather than that, just feel free to ask anything, and yeah.
I, of course, would only use Neo4j browser. I don't even recognize these other names. No, I would love VS Code integration and IntelliJ. Those are the two that I bounce between. I used to spend a lot of time with Eclipse, but I haven't had as much occasion to.
And I might miss some popular editor here, so just write it in the comments in the chat. Emacs editor, for example.
Oh yeah. And don't forget them.
Exactly, Notepad++.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess part of the motivation behind this query, I guess, is us just user behavior. Of course, we want to make Neo4j browser itself a much better environment. We want to improve the editor inside Neo4j browser. But no matter how much we improve it, we recognize that probably you're going to spend most of your time using one editor for all the different reasons you need an editor. And so we'd love to support that. We'd love to make sure that it's possible to switch between Neo4j and the editor that you've got of choice. Cool. And I should check the chat. I'm sorry, there's all kinds of comments here. I should have taken a look. Notepad+, NetBeans. Oh, NetBeans. How could I forget NetBeans?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Awesome. Is there going to be a browser extension? Tell me about that. In which way you're thinking about extending browser, or browser being an extension to an editor, or something else? And feel free to just go ahead and speak if you'd like to. You can unmute.
Okay. Are you listening? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I thought it would be better explain it to you a little bit instead of typing it. Basically, let's say, for example, you got. I'll give you an example. Let's say Microsoft Rewards. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you know about that. So now, what Microsoft have done, they've created an extension for either Edge browser, or they've created an extension for Chrome, and they've created an extension for other browsers. So instead of always being signed into like losing points as such, rewards basically, when you're browsing about, they've actually put it right into your your browser. So that's why I was saying that there could be a possibility of having an extension itself created by Neo4j in terms of this, and then that way, because it's going to be working under the browser interface anyway. So don't you think that would be a good idea of sort? Just to get your opinion, your views on that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I understand what you're saying now. So whether it's a Chrome extension or a Firefox extension, they all have sort of similar variations on the same capabilities. And I think there's now a cross-browser standard. I don't, but I know they released, we're working towards that. I think it might now be possible. So what could that mean? That could be that Neo4j browser itself is packaged and is available as an extension to, let's just say Chrome for the moment. So you could get a Chrome extension that is Neo4j browser. What that would end up meaning is that you could end up taking advantage of exactly, I guess, as you're saying, like we could have a consistent state of browser wherever it's being used. It would just load up the extension and run that as an application rather than having to load it as a web page. So it's somewhere in between being a progressive web app or something, or a single page web app that kind of loads its state into service workers or something. And actually, this is the first time I've really thought about it too much, but I'm not sure, because I'm not sufficiently familiar. Do you happen to know, like, what other advantages would we get by being a browser extension? Are there APIs that we'd be able to access that would not otherwise be available to us, or? I'm sorry, I'm answering your question with a question, of course, which is always poor. But
oh, sorry. No, I was saying, yeah, probably the APIs would be available on your local machine. Then probably. I would say probably the APIs will be available on your local machine. Probably. That's what I'm
right.
saying.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea. It's something that we should definitely take a look at and see. It might actually not be that much effort for us as well. So it's worth taking a look at to see, what that would mean for us. Yeah, thank you for the suggestion.
All right, it's about time to finish. Oh, actually, I could share the results. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Anyway, if you, okay, is there any more questions, or should we wrap up and continue offline, online, on Slack, anywhere else?
Yeah, and if you want to follow up with us later, like the public Slack group is the best place to do that.
And also, as we say, stay tuned for the next release. We would like to have more attendees for this kind of sessions every time we have a new version of our products. And it's very important to know your opinions, your ideas, your complaints, all of those things. So please don't miss out next time. And thank you so much for attending. And thank you, Andreas, for hosting and presenting it.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas and Lisa.
Yes, thanks very much.
Bye.
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 Bye.